On the evening of December 24th, 2001, a 48-year-old businessman named Kevin Butler was in his kitchen inside of his home in Dallas, Texas, preparing food. The following day, he was going to bring this food to a Christmas party at his friend's house. And as Kevin was preparing this food, he heard his friend Larry, who spent a lot of time at his house, call to him from down the hall. Now, Kevin didn't really hear what Larry wanted, but he could tell from the tone of his voice that, he wanted him to come over there right now. And so Kevin said, okay, I'll be there in a second. But then, after washing off his hands and beginning to walk down the hall to go see Larry, Kevin heard another sound that stopped him in his tracks. He heard the sound of two men's voices coming from outside of his house. The men sounded drunk, and they sounded like they were literally in his front yard. And also, Kevin thought he recognized the voices. And so instinctively, Kevin flew over to the door and whipped it open. And sure enough, it was Johnny Serna, one of Kevin's former employees, and Daniel Torres, who was Johnny's half-brother. These were the two men he thought he heard outside, and here they are. And even though Kevin was expecting to see them when he opened the door, it was like seeing them in real life was just totally incendiary. Kevin was immediately so mad. For several months, Kevin and Johnny had been in this very public feud over money. And in fact, Johnny at one point had even tried to steal from Kevin by forging a check. And so now Kevin looked right at Johnny and Daniel and goes, "Oh, what are you guys here to steal from me again?" And in response, Johnny didn't say anything. He just charged forward and punched Kevin square in the face. Kevin was so stunned that he practically fell over. And then before he could do anything, Johnny and Daniel had pummeled him to the ground and were kicking and punching him. And then they dragged him further into his house and slammed the door behind him. Kevin continued to try to get away, but he just couldn't. One of the brothers was holding him down. And then before long, one of the others had gone off and come back with electrical cord, and they tied him up. And then once Kevin literally was fully bound and couldn't go anywhere, the brothers went into the kitchen, got knives, came back, and they began stabbing Kevin over and over and over again. And as all this commotion was happening out in the living room, Kevin's friend Larry, who was right down the hall, heard the whole thing. He heard the sound of, the two drunk guys coming in. He heard the sound of Kevin clearly being attacked. And at first, Larry was terrified and didn't know what to do. But as he heard the sound of Kevin screaming out for help, Larry jumped into action, and he flew down the hallway and he charged out there, and he saw Daniel still on top of Kevin stabbing him, and Larry just went right after Daniel. Now, Larry was unarmed and really didn't stand much of a chance to begin with, but he did whatever he could to try to get Daniel off. He began biting and scratching him and doing whatever he could, but it wasn't enough. And eventually, Daniel overpowered Larry, and then before long, Johnny and Daniel were not just stabbing Kevin, but were also stabbing Larry. And so in the end, both Kevin and Larry, the two friends, were stabbed to death. And then after they were dead, Johnny and Daniel fled the scene. But what the two half-brothers didn't know was that even though they had just killed Larry, Larry had actually just made sure those two brothers would get caught. Because when Larry tried to fight Daniel off, he had literally bit Daniel and gotten Daniel's blood on his mouth. And ultimately, when the police showed up, they took the blood from Larry's mouth, and that was DNA evidence, and it led them right to Daniel. And so Daniel and Johnny were soon arrested and charged with murder. However, they were only charged with one murder. And that's because during the attack, when Larry flew down the hall to try to protect Kevin, well, he literally flew. Because Larry was not a person. Larry was Kevin's pet cockatoo, and he was named after Larry Bird. Kevin had adopted Larry 2 years earlier, and the two had become like best friends. And so when Larry heard his best friend Kevin being attacked, he flew in to try to help, and he wound up clawing and pecking at Daniel's head, ultimately getting Daniel's blood on his beak, which led to their arrest. Daniel Torres and Johnny Serna were both ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. 6:30 p.m. on July 29th, 2023, a 15-year-old girl named Talia Davila Diaz stood right outside her back door of her house, staring out at the thick, dense, shadowy rainforest that was her backyard. Talia lived in a tiny, isolated village in Peru that was literally in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. So as she was looking out, she would have seen these huge tropical trees and heard the sound of howler monkeys and exotic birds and animals moving all about, and the air would have been really thick and humid. But she wasn't thinking about any of that. Instead, she was focused on this grapefruit tree that was only a few yards away from her house. She wanted to go get a grapefruit and bring it inside and make juice for her family. However, Talia was scared. And she was scared for two reasons. The first reason was this was the Amazon, an inherently dangerous place, especially at night. There were loads of predators out there, like snakes and jaguars. But the other reason she was scared was that she was worried there could actually be something worse out in the rainforest, worse than any predators she was used to. And that was because over the last couple of weeks, people in Talia's village had been claiming they were seeing these shadowy figures lurking in the tree line with these bright green eyes that would occasionally seem like they were hunting the people of the village. Like anytime they went out, it was like these figures were kind of lurking off in the distance, but nobody knew what they were. The rumor around the village was that these shadowy figures were actually pelikaras, which translates literally to face peelers. People in Talia's village believed that pelikaras were foreigners who would kidnap locals and cut their throats and peel the skin of their face off and then sell their body fat on the black market. And the locals were so freaked out that pelikaras could be around that they began performing nightly patrols to keep the villagers safe. So Talia, again, was very scared to even leave her house at this point. But she was also trying to be reasonable. I mean, she'd gone out and gotten a grapefruit many times in the past. This was not some new behavior, so she's looking out and she sees the grapefruit tree and she knows there's a nightly patrol out right now, and I only have to go a few yards and get the fruit and get right back in the house. Like, how big of a deal could this possibly be? And so after taking one more look around and not seeing anybody or hearing anything that was out of place, she took a breath and then rushed out to the tree. She grabbed a grapefruit, and as she was turning around, she froze because her worst nightmare had just been realized. Now, standing between her and her back door were these two hulking dark figures. And one of them was like so tall, it was practically the size of a tree. And they both had these piercing, glowing green eyes. And they were looking right at Talia. And Talia was so instantaneously petrified that all she could do was just stand there and stare back into their green eyes. And as she did, she began to notice that their faces were grotesquely elongated, almost like they had masks on. And then before Talia could do anything, the really tall one began sort of gliding towards her. Not stepping towards her, but literally almost hovering off the ground towards Talia. And then suddenly, Talia was being grabbed and thrown to the ground. And the instant Talia hit the ground, these two figures descended on her and pinned her there. And then one of them reached down and pressed their hand over her mouth and her nose, and she couldn't breathe. And then she sees the other one is holding what looked like a box cutter or a knife, and they put it right up to her neck. And suddenly it's like Talia understands these are pelikaras. They're gonna slit her throat. They're gonna kill her. And so she has this sudden burst of energy and she manages to push them off of her. And when she did, their hand came off her mouth and she screamed out for help. And she heard somewhere in the village voices yelling back to her, and then she heard footsteps, and she knew it was the night patrol coming to save her. And so at this point, the figures released Talia, and she scrambled to her feet and immediately ran towards her house right as the night patrol came bounding into her yard, and one of the men had a gun, and he raised it and began shooting in the direction of the figures. And Talia, she's totally panicked, and she turns around, and she looks at her attackers, and she's expecting them to, be fleeing into the rainforest. But instead, these dark figures, they were like levitating in the sky, and they were looking down at Talia and the night patrol with their glowing green eyes as they literally began to levitate into the sky. And the whole time, the night patrol is firing repeatedly at these things, and they just drifted off into the night and disappeared. Talia ultimately would not suffer any physical injuries from this encounter, but mentally, she was a wreck. And frankly, so was the rest of the people in her village, especially those who were on the night patrol and with Talia witnessed these figures with green eyes flying away into the sky. I mean, the fear in this village following this encounter was through the roof. And in fact, ultimately, the Peruvian government would get involved after this encounter, and they would investigate to try to figure out, what happened to Talia. And they would ultimately conclude that there was an illegal mining operation happening somewhere in the rainforest, and some of these miners, in an effort to scare people away from coming anywhere near their operation, they got their hands on jetpacks, wore armor and masks, and then went into villages like Talia's and basically pretended to be aliens and then did, fly off on their jetpacks. That is the official story as of right now. However, people like Talia and the other people in her village and many other people who live in the Amazon rainforest who have come in contact with these figures with green eyes, they say those are no miners. Those are either palicaras or they are creatures from another world. On the afternoon of May 21st, 1974, a 39-year-old man named Pilar Gomez walked through a forest in Argentina. In his hand was a machete and an axe. And as he walked, he used the machete to clear brush, and then eventually he reached this huge tree, and he put the machete down, gripped his axe, and got ready to chop it down. However, before Pilar took his first swing, he looked up and he noticed pretty high up on this tree were these very deep claw marks right into the bark of the tree. Now, at first he thought, oh, that's gotta be, a bear's claw marks. But the more he looked at it, the more he realized that would have been an enormous bear to leave marks like those. I mean, these are deep and wide claw marks. Now, Pilar was a professional lumberjack, and he actually lived in this section of forest. He owned this plot of the forest. His cabin was only a few yards away, and he was used to coming in contact with the wildlife, like bears. Now, his friends and family thought he was crazy for living out here. I mean, his neighbors were miles away. He didn't have a phone or a car. He lived totally alone. And so, in virtue of living in this isolated forest, Pilar routinely came across animals that lived out here, like bears. And it didn't really frighten him. He sort of understood that's part of living out here. But he knew his friends and family thought he was totally crazy for living out here. And not just because it was so isolated, not just because he didn't have a car or a phone and was totally alone basically 24/7, but because, according to local legend, this particular forest was effectively haunted. There were these apparent unnatural huge creatures that roamed this forest and would prey on people like Pilar. But Pilar didn't believe in any of that nonsense. He knew that, as he looked at these claw marks, this has to be a bear. This is not some huge unnatural creature that's completely made up. And so Pilar just went ahead and began cutting this tree down. And right as this tree smashed into the ground, making a thundering boom, at the exact same moment, basically right behind Pilar, he heard this horrible growling noise, like a huge animal was basically coming up right behind him. And so Pilar, he whipped around and looked, but there was nothing there. It was just a wide open forest. Everywhere he looked, it was just trees, nothing else. And so Pilar began to think to himself, did I even hear that? I mean, could I really have just been hearing the sound of the tree hitting the ground that somehow also sounded like a growl behind me? Like, am I, psyching myself out here? Am I creating stories in my head because I'm thinking about those claw marks? And he was like, you know what? It's all gonna be in my head. I didn't hear anything. I'm all alone out here. I'm safe. I'm good. And so Pilar just got back to work processing this tree. For the next couple of hours, he didn't see or hear anything strange. He just continued to chop this tree into smaller pieces, and then he would carry those pieces right over to his cabin, which again was not far away, and he stacked up this huge pile of lumber right beside the side of his cabin. And then finally, when the tree was all processed and Pilar was back in his cabin, he realized he was pretty hungry. At this point, it was getting dark outside and it was time for dinner. Typically, Pilar would eat his dinner outside. He enjoyed listening to the crickets and just feeling the warm night air, and tonight was no exception. So he grabbed some stew from the night before, he went outside, and outside he had this table that was right next to his cabin, and then just beyond the table, farther away from the cabin, was this wood stove. And so he got the wood stove going, and then he put his stew on the stove to warm up, and then he sat down at the table, and he just sat there, enjoying the night, waiting for his food to be done. And as Pilar just sat there relaxing, he suddenly realized that he couldn't hear any crickets. They had gone completely silent. And then as he looked around at the dark forest, he realized the forest was actually silent. I mean, there was no noise whatsoever. The only noise was his stove. And Pilar knew that the only time the forest got this way was if there was some big predator around. And so right away, Pilar thought back to the claw marks in the tree and, that growling sound that he wasn't sure if he heard or not. And he's thinking, maybe the bear is back. And so Pilar scanned the tree line, trying to see movement. But there was nothing. It was just deadly silent and just a dark forest in all directions. And so feeling really unsettled, Pilar decided he should just go back inside his cabin and eat in there where it was more safe. And so Pilar stood up and he walked towards his cabin and he was about to go inside when he remembered he had left the stove on with the stew on top warming up. And so he turned back around and he looked out at the dark forest and it's still totally silent. He can't see any movement. and as quick as he could, he walked past the table, out to the stove. He shut the vents in the stove, and he was about to grab the stew to go back inside with it when something really powerful struck him in the back, knocking the wind out of him. And then before he could react, he looked down and he saw this massive furry arm with sharp claws reaching around him, pulling at his midsection. It was the bear. And so immediately Pilar began thrashing, trying to get away, and he managed to kind of stumble forward, and his machete was on the ground near the stove. And he fumbles down, he grabs the machete, and he wheels around to strike this bear to get rid of it. But the second he saw the bear, he realized it wasn't a bear. And instinctively he knew he just had to run. And so he turned and began sprinting towards that lumber pile he had cut up before right next to his cabin. And as he was scrambling up this pile, he could hear the sound of this thing running towards him. And then he felt another explosion on the side of his head. And even though he now has been wounded, probably gravely, it was like all adrenaline. And he kept going up the lumber pile and he clambered onto the roof of his cabin. And he turned around, getting ready to fight as best as he could, whatever this thing was. But when he looked out, this thing was just gone. The forest was deadly silent again and there was nothing out there. And so as he's sitting there kind of looking around, waiting for this thing to pop back up again, he reached up and he felt the side of his head and his ear was missing. This thing had ripped his ear off when it hit him in the side of the head. Pilar would remain on the roof of his cabin all night, just constantly scanning, looking for this bear creature to return. But it didn't. The forest just remained totally silent and nothing happened all night. And then finally in the morning when the sun began to come up, the forest kind of went back to normal. And at that point, Pilar is kind of delirious from blood loss and the impact to his head. And he knew he just had to get out of here and go get help. And so he climbed off the roof and then he ran about a mile to the nearest building, which was this woodworking shop. And when he got there, there were a couple of people there. And when they saw the state Pilar was in, they didn't need to be told that he needed to go to the hospital. They just instinctively put him in the car and drove him there. After Pilar was stabilized and his wound was treated and he was sort of in recovery at the hospital, the police showed up to interview him to see what happened. And Pilar would tell them the story about how, the day before he had seen those claw marks in the tree and then he had heard that loud growling sound behind him, or so he thought. And then that night, this bear had attacked him at his cabin. And he said at some point he had broken away and grabbed the machete and he turned to defend himself and he got a good look at this bear. And it was at least 6 feet tall, it was covered in black hair, had sharp claws. I mean, it was every bit a bear, except its face. It wasn't a bear's face. It was a human face. Now, to this point, as Pilar was telling his story, one of the police officers was taking notes. Everything Pilar said, he was writing it down. But when Pilar began talking about the bear with the human face, the officer just stopped taking notes. And the officer said, that can't be true. There aren't any bears with human faces. But Pilar, he's like a rugged lumberjack who lives in the forest by himself. And he's telling these officers, I know how crazy this sounds. I know it's not realistic, but I'm telling you what I saw is this bear with a human face. That's what I saw. But the officer just 100% did not believe him. And ultimately, this went down as simply a bear attack, and that was it. The case was closed. However, despite what the police said, since the attack on Pilar, there have been at least 30 people who have come forward to say they either saw firsthand or were attacked by this bear-like creature with a human face in that forest in Argentina. Sightings are so common that locals even came up with a name for this creature. They call it the Ucumar. And to this day, nobody has any idea who or what it is. One day in March of 2012, a 5-year-old girl named Maria sat on the floor of her kitchen in a city in northeast Brazil, eating an empada and watching her aunt cook some stew. An empada is very similar to the empanada in that it is a pie filled with meat, but the empada is the Brazilian version of that pie. Maria's family was actually known for their cooking, specifically their empadas. In fact, at this very moment, Maria's mother was out selling their famous empadas on street corners and in bars and local restaurants. Now, the family got by okay this way, but despite their notoriety around these empadas, they really wanted more. They wanted their family name to be respected, to be powerful. And so to try to make that happen, Maria's family basically worked 24/7. Not just on making empadas, but basically in looking for ways to kind of grow and expand the family name. In fact, while Maria was sitting on the kitchen floor, she could hear her father in the other room working. And the reason she knew he was working is because periodically she could hear him yell out with excitement. He was basically sitting there coming up with ideas of how he could make the family name even bigger and better. And when he had a good idea, he would shout out and be like, "Oh, I found it!" And in addition to constantly sort of brainstorming for ideas of how to become rich and powerful, Maria's father also was an author, and he was writing a book that he was convinced was going to be another thing that would kind of ratchet their family up the social hierarchy. But because Maria's mother and father and basically everybody in her family were so completely immersed in work all the time, it meant they didn't really pay much attention to her. And so most of the time, Maria was just kind of on her own, usually playing in the kitchen or playing in the backyard. Just then, the front door opened and in walked Maria's mother, and she was grinning ear to ear, not only because she now had an empty tray, meaning she had sold all her empadas, but also she had brought someone along that she was really excited to introduce to Maria. Maria's mom stepped all the way into the kitchen, and right behind her was this young woman. And Maria's mother pointed at this young woman and then gestured for Maria to come over and say hi. And she told Maria that this young woman wants to become her new nanny. And so you guys can play together all the time while me and your father are out doing our work. Maria stood up and gave a shy smile to the young woman, but she wasn't sold that this woman actually would become her nanny. Because in the past, there had been other women who had come by to be her nanny, and they didn't seem to last very long. And so Maria was not getting her hopes up. Still, Maria wanted to be friendly, so she walked over and, as a gesture of goodwill, she handed this woman her half-eaten empada. And the young woman took the empada and laughed and said, "Thank you." After that, Maria's mother told her to head on out back and go play by herself for a bit, while she and this new nanny hammered out the details of her new job. And she told Maria that as soon as they were done, the new nanny would come outside and join her, and they could play together. And so Maria, who was always very obedient, did as she was told, and she headed out back and entertained herself. And the whole time, as she's just kicking rocks around and pulling grass up and just kind of doing what kids do, she kept looking back at the house, waiting for the nanny to come outside. But she didn't. And after a whole hour had passed by and still this new nanny had not come outside, Maria felt really bored. And so she went inside to go look for her. A month later, Maria was out in her backyard playing by herself like usual when she heard a commotion happening inside of her house. She looked over at the house and couldn't really tell what was going on, and then she heard the sound of her mother and her father and her aunt raising their voices like they were fighting with somebody. And then all of a sudden, these uniformed police officers came charging out the back door towards Maria. One of the officers came right up to her and asked her what her name was, and Maria was so scared, remember she's 5 years old here, that she didn't even know what to say, so she just stood there staring, being totally terrified. She had no idea what was going on. But, as these police officers would soon tell her, it would turn out her entire life was one big, horrific lie. Maria's father, George Silvera, was not actually her father, nor was Maria's mother, Isabel Silvera, her actual mother, nor was her aunt, Bruna Silva, actually her aunt. In reality, those three people were not related to Maria. They were instead members of a cult called the Cartel Sect. And all these three cult members cared about was impressing the members of the cult. When they thought about, making it big, their so-called family name becoming bigger and more powerful, that was all in relationship to the Cartel Sect. They wanted the members of this cult to look at them as the most powerful and important members of that cult. And the way they tried to do that was by performing the duties of this cult to the best of their abilities, better than anybody else in the cult. And so what did this cartel care about? Well, the literal purpose of the Cartel Sect was to eliminate women they deemed unclean in order to reduce and purify the world's population. And Maria's family, the mother, the father, and the aunt, had become very well versed at doing this. All those nannies that came around to see Maria, well, the reason they kept vanishing is because shortly after the mother, the father, and the aunt introduced them to Maria and said, "Oh, she's gonna be your new nanny," they would shoo Maria out into the backyard, and then they would murder the nanny because this person had been deemed unclean. They would cut their throats and stab them to death. But that wasn't all. That wasn't enough cleansing. After they murdered these women, they would then butcher them and stuff the human meat into their famous empadas and sell them to the people in town. They literally were feeding people in this city human meat. But the cult and the cannibalism and the murders were not actually the biggest shock of this story. The biggest shock of the story is actually the real identity of little 5-year-old Maria. She was actually the daughter of the very first victim of the cartel sect. The mother, along with Maria 3.5 years earlier, when Maria was just 1.5 years, they had been lured to this very house where her mother was murdered right in front of Maria. And then after her mother was killed, they cooked her mother and fed pieces of the mother to Maria. And ever since, they had just kept Maria and treated her like she was a member of the family, basically turning her into an unwitting cannibal. The existence of the cult and their hideous murders were ultimately discovered after they used one of the credit cards of their victims sometime in the spring of 2012. That's when all the cops rushed into the backyard and confronted Maria. George, Isabel, and Bruna, Maria's fake family, were convicted of 3 murders, including the murder of Maria's real mother, and they are currently serving what amounts to life sentences in Brazil. Police believe the actual number of women that they murdered is as many as 8. As for Maria, according to recent news articles, she was reunited with distant family. Maria is not her real name. That is a pseudonym to protect her identity. On January 23, 1989, a mother was cooking dinner in her home in Rochester, New York, when her 11-year-old daughter came into the kitchen. The daughter had just finished delivering newspapers along her delivery route in their quiet suburban neighborhood, and so her mother asked her the same nightly question: how was the route? And usually the daughter replied with just a good, but tonight was different. Instead, her daughter said, "It's okay." And the mother pried, like, "Well, what do you mean? What happened?" And the daughter said, "Well, I saw something strange." She told her mom that she delivered newspapers to this one particular old man. He was very nice and he always waved to her whenever she went by. And tonight was no different. He had waved to her, but there was just something off about the way he was sitting. The mother asked, what do you mean? And the daughter, she really struggled to articulate what she had seen. 1, it was dark. 2, the man was sitting inside of a screened-in porch that kind of obscured her view, and the awnings were pretty low, making it hard to look in. But she said basically when she had gone past, the man had waved to her like normal, but his legs appeared to be straight up in the air, like he was sitting on a chair and his legs were like up, vertical, right in front of him. In fact, when he waved, it was like he was waving between his legs at her. And so when the mother heard this, she really didn't know what to make of it. I mean, the story didn't make any sense. She couldn't really understand how this guy was sitting where his legs would be straight up in the air like that. But at the same time, she could tell her daughter was worried, and she kind of figured that maybe her daughter's imagination had run wild here. And so she told her daughter, like, "Hey, look, if he waved to you, then I'm sure everything is just fine. Don't worry about it." But the following night, when the girl came back from her route once again, she was even more upset about this guy out on his porch. She told her mom that once again, she looked in the porch and there he was sitting there with his legs straight up in the air, except this time he didn't wave to her, including when she made a point to stop and wave at him. He did not wave back. Now, the girl told her mom that she was worried about him, and so she went right up to the door to go check on him. But the screened-in porch was locked, so she couldn't get inside, and her view was kind of obscured because of the screen, so she couldn't really see him in there. But she didn't know what to do, so she just left. Now, this story, which was already weird, now did seem a whole lot weirder that 2 days in a row her daughter is seeing this. But the mother's thinking to herself, like, come on, this is just some older guy who loves this chair and, he's fallen asleep in some weird position here. And, my daughter is sort of exaggerating what she's seeing. Like, this can't be a big deal here. But again, seeing the concern on her daughter's face, she told her daughter, look, don't worry about it. I'm sure everything's fine. I will go by tomorrow morning and make sure he's okay. So the next morning, a little before 11 a.m., the mother arrived on the street where this old man lived. And as she was walking down the road towards the house, she actually spotted the mailman. And so before she went any farther, she flagged the mailman down and she asked him, like, hey, is there anything weird going on with that old guy who lives right over there? But the mailman was like, no, he's just a nice older guy who waves at everybody who goes by. And so the mother thanked the mailman and did give some thought to just, taking what the mailman said and turning back around and heading home and telling her daughter everything's fine. But, she knew her daughter was really worried about this guy, and so she decided she would just continue down the road and check on this guy for herself and just really make sure he's okay, and then report back to her daughter. And also the mother was thinking, it's about 20 degrees outside. It's very cold. This is not really a good time for an older man to be outside so much. So what's he doing? Let's really make sure he's okay. And so the mother made her way down the road and she reached the old man's house. And sure enough, the screened-in porch really did obscure, whoever was inside of it. She could see a silhouette of what appeared to be this old man sitting there. But the first thing she actually noticed was not him, but rather the 2 newspapers that were sitting right on his walkway, uncollected. These are the newspapers that her daughter had left over the same period of time that she's seeing this weird thing happening with this guy. And so suddenly the woman's feeling like that's a pretty big red flag. And so she hustled her way right up towards the front. And as she did, she looked into the screened porch and waved at this old man to try to get his attention, like, hey, are you okay in there? But the man did not wave back. And so the mother went right up to the door and she checked it, but like her daughter had said, it was locked. And so the mother, she pressed her face up against the mesh screen that kind of had been obscuring her view from a distance. And she put her face right up against the screen where she would have a clear view inside. And when she did, and she saw the old man who was in fact right there, and he did in fact have his legs up, when she saw him, she realized what was actually going on. And the second she did, she jumped back, turned around, and ran away to go call the police. It would turn out the old man who lived there, whose name was Robert Ham, and he was 73 years old, he was not just eccentric and sitting weirdly on his front porch. Instead, on January 23rd, right before that little girl had come home and told her mother that this man had been acting strangely, on that evening, Robert had come out onto his screened-in porch, and for whatever reason, he had attempted to sit down on this trash can that was out there on the porch. But the lid didn't hold, and so Robert fell butt first into this trash can, folding him up into this V position where his legs were straight up in front of him. And Robert was too weak to get himself out of the trash can, and also because of being in this V position where his legs were pressed up against his torso, it was restricting his ability to breathe and to make any sound. And so all he could do in this position was just wave at passerby, hoping they would see he was in trouble and go help him. But unfortunately, nobody could really tell what he was doing, including the little girl on the paper route. They just thought there was this guy sitting in his porch in this weird position, waving to people, when in reality, he was dying. And so unfortunately, because nobody came to his aid, Robert did die. He would die of a heart attack, and in fact, by the time that little girl's mother arrived at his house and put her face up against the screen, Robert was already dead. At around 7:30 a.m. on September 25th, 2012, a 69-year-old farmer named Terry Garner stepped out of his house in rural Oregon to go feed his animals. He stopped first at his enclosed yard, where he spread some seed on the ground for his chickens and turkeys, and then he headed over to his pen, where he was raising 4-horned goats, which are goats that grow 4 horns instead of 2. And after picking up some hay and tossing it in with the goats, Terry just stood there and smiled as he watched the animals eat. Terry loved his animals. He actually had previously been a butcher for most of his life, but 6 years earlier, when he had retired, he had kind of gone the opposite direction, basically housing all these animals and treating them basically like people. In fact, he was so devoted to his animals that sometimes when the nearby river would flood, he would move all of his animals into this house he had built on his property just for the animals to make sure they were safe. And if you ever went to visit Terry at his property, it was pretty common to see a lot of the chickens and other birds just kind of hanging out on the front porch of Terry's house. He didn't care. He liked having them around. But of all the creatures that Terry took care of at his farm, the animal he loved the most were his pigs. Now, normally when farmers raise pigs, they grow them to about 250 to 300 pounds, and then they sell them to butchers to be slaughtered. But that's obviously not what Terry was doing here. He loved these pigs so much that he basically just fed them anytime they were hungry, and they were hungry all the time, which meant his pigs sometimes grew to be like 700 pounds, and at no point was Terry gonna sell those pigs. He just wanted his pigs to live their best life. So on this morning, after he was done feeding his chickens and turkeys and the goats, he grabbed a whole bunch of food and began making his way over to his beloved pigs. A few hours later, a member of Terry's family arrived at Terry's property and knocked on his door. This family member had called Terry earlier in the day and Terry hadn't picked up. Now that in and of itself was not that uncommon. Terry was a busy farmer, but Terry always called people back. And so far, he hadn't. And so this family member was here just to check on him and make sure he was okay. And so after a few minutes, when Terry did not come to the door, the family member grew more concerned about Terry and decided they would just walk the whole property and just go find Terry and see what he was doing. And so the family member left the porch and walked all around the property. They saw where the chickens and turkeys were. They saw the goats. They saw the pigs. But that was it. All they saw were animals. Terry was nowhere to be found. It was like he was gone. And so the family member was just about to turn around and head back to Terry's house to see if, maybe he really wasn't there, when suddenly something caught their eye in the pig pen. Now, at first, what they were looking at just seemed impossible. Like, how could that be there? That doesn't make any sense. But when the family member walked over and got a closer look, they knew for sure what they were looking at. And as soon as that truth sunk in, they turned, ran to the house, and called the police. It would turn out, earlier that morning, when Terry had walked into the pig pen to feed his beloved enormous pigs, somehow or another, he had wound up on the ground. Now, we don't know if he had a heart attack or if he had some other medical event or if he simply just tripped and couldn't get up again, but one way or another, he wound up on the ground, and at some point, his pigs devoured him. And so what that family member saw in the mud that caught their eye was not Terry, but Terry's false teeth grinning back at him. Those teeth, along with several pieces of his body and his clothes, were all that was left of Terry. One more haunting detail of this case is that officials were not able to actually figure out whether or not Terry was dead before he began being eaten, or if he was just sort of incapacitated and very much alive when his beloved pigs began to eat him. On February 27, 2025, a man in his 30s named John grabbed a drink out of his fridge in his kitchen and then walked into his living room. He had just finished work and his wife and kids were out visiting his in-laws, and so tonight he was excited to just sit on the couch and watch TV. As he sat down, he called out to his dog. There was a huge thunderstorm outside, and he knew his dog was deathly afraid of thunder, and so he expected her to come running as soon as she heard her name. But after he called her, he heard nothing. But this didn't worry him because he figured, his dog must have found a good hiding spot and had just fallen asleep there. So John turned his attention to the TV and began looking for a horror movie to watch. But as he did, he started thinking about his wife and his kids driving home that night, and he was worried about them, because of the weather. So instead of clicking on a horror movie, he turned to the local news to check on the weather. However, as soon as the local news came on, it was not the weather they were talking about, despite this being a major storm. This should have kind of dominated the news, but it wasn't. Instead, there was a much bigger story on the news right now, and that was there was this huge riot happening at a state prison that was only 10 miles away from where John lived, and apparently the most dangerous convict at this prison had escaped. The newscasters began to describe this convict, and they said he actually had a nickname the other prisoners had given him. They called him the Monster of Cell Block C. Now, this nickname had to do in part with the fact that he was just a horrible criminal, like people were scared of him. And then also, the nickname came from his just totally bizarre and threatening behavior. He would routinely sit in the corner of his cell and eat insects off the ground. And then also, he kept jumping on prison guards every chance he got, which got him thrown in solitary confinement, where he just continued to eat the insects there and act totally unhinged. But perhaps the biggest reason he was dubbed the Monster of Cell Block C is because of his appearance. He had these crazy bulging eyes and this really thick neck. It made him look totally deformed. The anchors were telling locals to stay vigilant because the police had no idea where the Monster of Cell Block C was. Maybe he was still at the prison, but it did seem entirely possible that he really had escaped. And then it seemed like the anchors were about to put a picture up of the actual inmate himself, when suddenly John heard this huge boom of thunder outside, and then the power in his house just completely cut out, so the TV shut off. He didn't get to see what the inmate looked like. John instinctively reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone to use the flashlight feature, but his phone was dead. It had died like a couple minutes earlier, and he had told himself, I gotta plug this phone in, but he just hadn't done it yet, and now the power's out. So he has no light source. And on top of that, John couldn't help but feel sort of rattled. He had just heard on the news that, the Monster of Cell Block C has escaped 10 miles away, and now the power's out at his house in the middle of a storm, and he's all alone. But at the same time, John told himself, everything's fine. It's just a coincidence here that the power's gone out right at this moment. I'm fine. The state prison, it's 10 miles away. And why would this convict have any interest coming to my house? So I'm fine. And so John stood up and began heading towards his kitchen where he knew he kept a flashlight. But as he got close to the kitchen, he heard a strange sound. It was an electronic ding, like a phone notification sound. But at the same time, John really couldn't quite place it. And he also knew it couldn't be his phone because his phone was dead. However, he thought maybe it's my kids' iPads. After all, the sound he was hearing, the more he listened, he could tell it was coming from upstairs, and that's where his kids' iPads were. However, the sound still seemed really weird to John because it started suddenly, basically right after the power went out. He hadn't heard it before that. And also, if these were, notification sounds on his kids' iPads, you would think there would only be maybe 1 or 2 notifications. You wouldn't have, a string of notification sounds. But as John listened, he heard like this incessant amount of dinging coming from the upstairs. And it wasn't constant. It was sort of sporadic, like random dings kind of all over the place. But then John remembered that his kids' iPads had a messaging app on it so they could talk to their parents. And John remembered that, his phone is dead. His wife could be out there driving in the storm. And so maybe she was trying to get in touch with him, couldn't because his phone was dead. And so now she was trying to message him using their kids' iPads. And so suddenly his heart rate began to pick up. He ran into the kitchen, he grabbed the flashlight, turned it on, and he ran to the base of the stairs that led up to the second floor. And as he began ascending the stairs, he's hearing that dinging sound over and over and over again. He knows it's from somewhere upstairs, and he can't help but feel totally anxious about it, like he can't place it. It kind of sounds like an iPad, but at the same time, it doesn't. He doesn't really know what it is. And so up the stairs he goes, he's scanning all around. There's no movement in the house. He still hasn't seen his dog. He gets to the top of the stairs, and in their house, there was this hallway that ran right and left from the top of the stairs. John looked to the right and shined his flashlight down there, and it was just all darkness and totally silent. The dinging was coming from the left side of the hallway. John swung the flashlight around and he shined it, and as soon as he looked down the hallway to the left side, his heart really began to race. Because remember, the power is off inside of his house, so all the lights and everything should be off. But as he was looking down the hallway, he saw there was bright light coming out from underneath his closed bedroom door. And also, that dinging sound was coming from in his bedroom. And his kids' iPads were not in there. At this point, John was terrified, but he knew he had to go in there. He had to see what was going on inside of his house. And so, very nervously, he began walking down the hallway towards the closed door. And as he's walking, the dinging sound is getting louder and louder. And with each ding from inside of his room, that light that was on inside of there would sort of pulsate. And you could see the light pulsating from underneath the door. And so John is getting more and more nervous as he's getting closer and closer to this door. And then right as he's about to touch the door and actually go inside, he hears a new sound. And it's coming from behind him. In fact, it's coming from downstairs. It was like this thumping sound, like something thick and meaty was like hitting the wooden floors over and over again. John's first thought was, maybe he left a window open downstairs and that was just the sound of the rain coming in. But as he's listening to this thumping sound that's getting louder and closer to him, making its way towards the stairs, he's thinking, that can't possibly be the rain. That does not make any sense. So he thought, oh, it's gotta be my dog. And so he called out to his dog again, this time much more urgently. Frankly, he wanted the comfort at this point, but the dog didn't come. And that thumping sound continued, and it began to go up the stairs. At this point, John knew he needs to go over and see who is now coming up the stairs. He has to go look. But he's paralyzed with fear. He's in the middle of this huge storm, the power's out, he has no idea what's going on with his wife and his kids, there's this escaped convict down the road, he has all these strange noises in his house, and so he just stands there completely unsure what to do. And then finally, as this thumping sound is right about to crest the stairs and be in the hallway, whatever or whoever it was, John turned and just threw open his door, figuring, at least if I go in my bedroom, I can shut the door and create space between me and whoever this is. But the second he charged into his bedroom, holding the flashlight over his head like a baseball bat, to confront whatever was in there, he just froze because what he saw in front of him was horrifying. To understand what John saw and why it was so bad, you have to know that overall, John was a pretty nice guy. He was a good father, a good husband, he gave to charity, he took in stray animals. He was the kind of guy who would, if you dropped money out on the street, he'd pick it up and give it back to you. He's a good guy. But there was one aspect of his life where John wasn't so nice. In fact, you could make the case that he was sort of a monster himself. John, in one very specific way, was sort of a bully. Every day for the last 5 years, John had been personally bullying and torturing this one victim online, and then also riling up other people to do the same thing. And so on this night, when he flew into his bedroom to escape whatever else was going on in his house, what he saw in his bedroom that was so awful was his victim. And he knew for sure that his victim was here for revenge. John's victim turned attacker was standing right there in the middle of his bedroom, clutching John's dog in their fist, like they were about to squeeze the life out of her. And at the same time, the loud thumping sound that John had run away from into this room that was coming up the stairs, well, John heard it thump against the door to the bedroom. And so John realized that must be another attacker. There's 2 of them, and now I'm gonna die. And so instinctively, John whipped around and just stared at this door, getting ready for whoever this was to enter the room. And as the door began to swing open, John closed his eyes and put his hands up around his head, bracing for impact. And he's standing there literally waiting to die, but nothing happens. And after a few seconds, John, he opens his eyes and he looks around and he smiles. It would turn out the monster of Cell Block C really had escaped from that state prison during that riot. And after they got out, they went to John's house. But the monster of Cell Block C was not a dangerous, horrible criminal, at least not to John. In fact, the monster of Cell Block C was one of John's oldest friends, and he had broken out of prison for one reason: to save John and his dog. Immediately after entering the bedroom, the monster of Cell Block C leapt onto the attacker who was holding John's dog hostage and managed to free the dog. The dog ran to safety, and then the monster of Cell Block C basically wrestled the attacker onto the ground and restrained them. And as they did this, John, who's sort of standing off to the side, is so relieved, but also he was suddenly inspired. And he had this idea that not only would defeat his attacker for good, but also would keep his friend, the monster of Cell Block C, from going back to prison. John turned and ran out of the bedroom and went into one of his kids' rooms where he grabbed a frog stuffed animal. He ripped the head off, and then he went back into his own bedroom and superglued the frog head onto the top of his attacker. John's attacker, the one he had bullied for so many years, who had come back for revenge, who was in his bedroom emitting pulsing lights and making dinging sounds and grabbed John's dog by their fist and held them hostage, was none other than the like button. John was actually John Allen, aka me, Mrballen. And with that frog head superglued on top of the like button, now they looked a whole lot like the monster of Cell Block C, which of course was my best friend, Seagull Lung. And so when the police showed up a short time later, they carted away the like button because they looked like the monster of Cell Block C. To this day, the like button is still serving out old Lungy's prison sentence. And as for old Seagull Lung, he's somewhere on a beach in Mexico. And now that this story is over, I can finally say, April Fools. 2016, a 45-year-old hiker named Zhang Shenpeng stood at the entrance to the famous Maclehose Wilderness Trail in southern China. He reached into his backpack, pulled out his phone, aimed it at the trail, and took a photo. Now, this trail was very beautiful, which is why he was taking a photo of it, but it also had a reputation for being a very dangerous trail. It was located in an area called the Sai Kung Peninsula, and the trail itself was about 100 kilometers long, or 62 miles. And it went through forests and mountains and streams, and the weather along this trail was very unpredictable, with sudden storms rolling in and just wreaking havoc. But Zhang was feeling very confident about this hike because he himself was an experienced hiker. While he maybe hadn't done this particular trail, he had hiked similar trails, and also the weather appeared to be holding up. However, before Zhang could even take a step onto this trail, the sky suddenly turned this dark greenish hue, and there was a loud thunderclap. I mean, basically instantly, there was this massive storm overhead. Zhang couldn't believe it. He just stood there watching as this unbelievable storm rolled in, wondering what he should do. I mean, again, he had not prepared for a storm. It was supposed to be nice out. But as he's kind of weighing whether or not he should just turn around and head back home because it was now too dangerous, the sky, just as suddenly as this all began, cleared. And it was suddenly beautiful and bright out, and the storm was gone. Now, at first, Zhang was not entirely convinced that the storm was now just magically gone, and so for a few minutes, he just stood there waiting in case it came back. But it didn't. The sky remained beautiful and clear. And so eventually, Zhang posted that photo he had taken of the trail, and he captioned it with something to the effect of, very strange weather out here, but I'm continuing my hike. And then after posting the photo, he put his phone away and began walking down the MacLehose Trail. At first, as Zhang headed off into the forest, he made good time. It was warm out, but not too hot, and his pack was fairly light. And also, the views were just stunning. Every time he came to a rise on the trail, he could look out and see the waves of the South China Sea, and the air was so clear and crisp. I mean, it was a really relaxing and beautiful place to be. Certainly a big change from what he was used to, which was the noise and crowds of the city. And so Zhang just continued on his hike, stopping periodically to take more photos. But after about an hour of this hike, when things were still going really well, Zhang reached this fairly steep incline on the trail, and he began walking up it. There had been past inclines on the trail, and he had been fine. But as he began maneuvering up this particular incline, he began to feel kind of woozy. In fact, more specifically, he began to feel like the air all around him was getting really hot, like somebody was turning up the temperature all around him. And so Zhang, he stopped as he was making his way up this incline to kind of catch his breath. But as he did that, the heat just got worse and worse. He became delirious. And as he was almost towards the top of this hill, it was like he just couldn't go any further. And the world began to spin all around him. And before long, he was tumbling to the ground and blacking out. The next thing Zhang became aware of was the feeling of grass pressed up against his cheek. He was laying on the trail. So he kind of opened his eyes and he sat up for a second, and he was very disoriented. He didn't know how long he had been out for. He figured it was only a couple of minutes. But as he kind of got his bearings, the first thing he noticed is the sky was now totally dark. And when he had passed out, it was broad daylight. And so he's thinking, that can't possibly be true. I can't have been here for hours. That's not possible. And so he began to think to himself like, oh, I guess another storm has rolled in. That's why the sky is so dark. It's not nighttime. But then when he reached into his bag and pulled out his phone and saw the time and saw it was 8 o'clock at night, he realized there was no storm. It really is nighttime. He had been unconscious on this trail for apparently like 12 hours. And so as Zhang just stared at his phone in disbelief, his phone began to ring, and it was his wife. And so Zhang's thinking, oh my goodness, I'm supposed to be home right now. My wife is definitely worried about me. And so pretty quickly, he kind of composed himself, even though, again, he has no idea what's happening here. And he answers the call, and as cheerful as he could, he told his wife that everything was fine, he was just running late, and he would be home soon. And so she said, okay. And then after Zhang hung up with her, he put his phone back in his backpack and pulled out a flashlight. And then he stood up and kind of checked himself over for cuts and scrapes and bruises. He had no idea what condition he was in here. But after checking himself over, he seemed okay. I mean, he was still very disoriented and confused, but physically he was okay. And then, again, even though he doesn't understand what's happening here, he's just thinking, okay, I gotta turn around, get back to the car, and get home as quickly as possible. And so he slung his backpack, and with his flashlight out in front of him, he just started hoofing it back down the trail in the direction of his car. Now, as Zhang walked along, he was feeling very unsettled, but he kept telling himself that, independent of whatever's happened here, he was going to be home soon and everything was going to be fine. However, not long into his return trip towards his car, he began to get this unbelievably bad feeling, like something was just totally wrong here. And as he began having this feeling, he suddenly took stock of the fact that the forest he was in, which had been so alive with life and sound and everything, was now completely silent. No insects, no animals. The stream nearby was making no sound. It was like he was in a void. And it was so eerie. And he stopped and just listened. And it was like the whole world was on mute. And so Zhang, who now was starting to feel scared, just began scanning his flashlight all around him, not even sure what he was looking for. But as he did, he had another realization. Suddenly the area he was in did not look familiar at all. I mean, he had only walked maybe several paces away from where he had just fallen to the trail and passed out. But now as he looked around,
it was like he was in a totally different section of the forest. I mean, he looked back where he had fallen, and even in the grass where he would have been, it was untouched. There was no impression on the ground from where he would have been laying for 12 hours, like he'd been transported somewhere else without knowing it. Now, when Zhang spoke to his wife on the phone, he was very careful not to alarm her, even though he had sort of a growing sense of panic inside of him. But now, the whole situation was sort of out of hand. He really didn't understand what was happening, and he knew he needed help. And so he reached into his backpack to pull out his phone to call for help, except when he reached into his bag, there was nothing there. His phone was gone, his supplies were gone, the bag was totally empty, even though literally minutes before it had been full. Like there was no way he just randomly lost this stuff. It had been there, and now it was gone. And so Zhang desperately looked on the ground with his flashlight, and he walked back in the direction where he believed he had fallen, even though it didn't look like the same place. He's looking all over the place like, maybe he did drop his stuff, but he didn't. It was just gone. And so now, really feeling scared, Zhang just completely lost his composure and began screaming at the top of his lungs for help. But he heard nothing in response, just silence. And then not long after that, Zhang's head began to feel heavy again, and then he sank to the ground, put his head in the dirt, and he closed his eyes.
Hey guys, I have an incredible announcement. Something I know is going to absolutely make your day. Something many of you may have waited years for me to say again. Beginning the first full week in the new year, so the week of January 5th, I am going to go from one measly upload on this channel a week to 2, 3, even 4 uploads a week. You heard that right. We're going back to 2, 3, even 4 times a week. You guys have been telling me that you want me to release more videos, and well, I and our whole team have been listening. So as always, make sure your notifications are on so you don't miss any of these amazing extra weekly uploads. It will not replace what you're already getting. This is all in addition to. It's going to be great. See you guys soon.
When Zhang woke up, it was bright out, and he also was now magically back at the original spot where he had passed out on that steep incline. And the first thing he did as soon as he came to is he reached into his bag, hoping that his phone and other supplies would have just materialized by now. But no, when he reached inside the bag, it was still empty. And so on the one hand, Zhang still is like, what is going on here? I don't understand what's happening. And then on the other, he was also becoming acutely aware that because he doesn't have his phone, he can't call for help, like he's stuck out here. And so he's wondering, like, what is he gonna do here? And then it dawns on him that, it's been at least several hours since he last spoke to his wife, and she was expecting him home the night before. And so by now, certainly, because he hasn't come home, she must have called the police. And so maybe there was already a search party out here looking for him. And so suddenly feeling kind of hopeful that that was actually happening, Zhang, despite his confusion and disorientation here, just scooped up his backpack, put it on, and began walking down the trail back in the direction towards his car. And as he walked, Zhang periodically would call out, hoping that again, some searchers or other hikers were nearby who would hear him and come to his aid. But after hiking for over an hour, he still had not reached his car. The forest was still eerily silent, like everything was silent. He hadn't seen or heard anybody else. I mean, he's totally alone here. And so Zhang started to wonder if maybe his best bet was not to try to hike out of here, but instead to just stay put and wait for, hopefully, the search party, if there was one out there, to come find him, or maybe some other hiker to come find him. However, as he was considering this, he looked up ahead where the trail kind of turned, and he saw there was this pond, a pond he had not seen on the way in, but nonetheless, there was a pond basically right over there. And from his perspective, he could see kind of through the trees on the other side of the pond appeared to be a person. Zhang suddenly felt this enormous sense of relief. Here was the person who was going to help him and get him out of here. And so Zhang began walking towards this person, and as he did, he cupped his hands and he called out a hello to get this person's attention. Now, when Zhang did this, he believed this person would either, 1, hear him, turn around and see what Zhang wanted, or 2, they wouldn't hear him, and they would just continue to stand there with their back to him. But neither of those things happened. When Zhang called out this very hearty hello, this person just instantly began sprinting away from Zhang without even turning to look at him. They just began taking off into the trees. And Zhang, he's thinking like this is a crisis for him. He has no idea what's happening here. This is the first person he's seen. He needs them. And so instinctively, Zhang just took off running after them, calling out the whole time, trying to reassure them that he was not a threat. He didn't mean to scare them. He needs their help. And so he gets to the pond. He runs around the perimeter. He can still see this person running off into the woods. And Zhang, like he's so exhausted from the lack of water and food, he's not feeling his best, but somehow through adrenaline alone, he starts gaining on this person. And eventually he closes the distance on this person as they're weaving through the trees. And suddenly this person just stops. And they don't turn around to look at Zhang, they just stop in the middle of the woods. And Zhang, he almost barrels into them because he had been running so quickly, and he just stops. And he's staring at the back of this person who still has not turned around to look at him at any point. And Zhang says to them, "Please, I need your help." And Zhang, he's panting, he's totally out of breath. And this person who's been running at top speed the whole time, they're not out of breath. They're not even moving. They're stationary, just with their back to Zhang. And suddenly, as Zhang is staring at this person, realizing that something feels off here, the person begins to turn around to look at him. And as they do, Zhang suddenly feels this incredible sense of dread. Like he chased this person down, he needs their help, but now that they're turning around to face him, something feels wrong and he doesn't want to see him. Something's off here. And then the person fully turns around and looks at Zhang, and Zhang is suddenly so terrified of what he sees, he holds his breath and just stays there frozen to the spot, staring. He can't believe what he's looking at. This was not a person. This was some sort of shadowy figure with no face, and it was now staring directly at Zhang. And Zhang, again, he's so scared he can't move, he's holding his breath, he's just looking right back at them, and then suddenly this figure takes an aggressive step toward Zhang, and then another, until suddenly they're inches away from Zhang, and Zhang is so terrified, he just closes his eyes, expecting to die at any second, and then when he opens his eyes, the figure's just gone. For about 5 minutes, Zhang just stood there, shaking in utter disbelief of what he had just experienced. I mean, this whole thing had been terrifying, but this specific interaction with this shadow figure was horrifying, and he had no idea how to process it. But at the same time, after a few minutes, Zhang's thinking to himself, I don't want to stay around here to try to figure out what's going on. I need to get out of here. And so Zhang finally, after mustering the courage, he turns to start walking back towards the pond and back up to the trail. But when he turns around, the pond isn't there anymore. It's just this endless expanse of trees. The pond should have been right there, and it's gone. And also, when Zhang took off running after this shadow figure, it was daylight. And now, it's darkness. It's total darkness. And so once again, Zhang has somehow gone to a new location and jumped through time, several hours at least, with no idea how that had even happened. And also, as he's having this realization that once again, it's like space-time has changed all around him, he starts to have that heaviness in his head, things start to swim all around him, and before long, he's fallen to the ground and he's closing his eyes. When Zhang woke up again, it was now suddenly bright out. So again, more time has passed. He was not just passed out for a minute or two, it was several hours at least. And also, Zhang was now magically laying right next to the pond that had vanished the night before after this figure had showed up. And so at this point, Zhang is seriously thinking to himself that he must have lost his mind. That's what's happening here. He's gone insane. Or does he have some horrible head injury that's like causing hallucinations or something? Like, he doesn't know. But at the same time, all he can do at this point is just get up, try to get back to the trail, and try to get back to his car and get back home. That's all he can do. And so that's what he did. Zhang made his way back up to the trail and began walking down the trail in the direction that he believed was back towards his car. But after hiking for a while, things did not look any more familiar. It was like he was hiking down a brand new trail that he had never been on before. The forest continued to be eerily silent, and every time he called out for help, he got nothing in response. And then eventually, Zhang reached a section of the trail that kind of sloped down, and when he got there and he looked out ahead of him, he saw down below there was this huge cemetery. Now, Zhang had studied this entire area before coming out on this hike, and he knew there was no cemetery in the middle of the MacLehose Trail. Like, this can't be here. But remember, by this point, Zhang has seen and experienced things that he cannot understand. So he doesn't even know what's real and what's not anymore. And so as he's looking at the cemetery, he told himself this has got to be some hallucination. This can't be here. But after walking down the hill and entering the cemetery, he reached out and touched the headstones, and they were very real. This cemetery absolutely, for right now anyways, was real and right in front of him. And as he looked at the dates on these headstones, he could tell the cemetery was at least 200 years old. And so as Zhang is taking in this new information, he looks up and he sees a couple hundred meters away from him is a group of what appears to be people clustered around a grave. And for a moment, Zhang feels this unbelievable sense of relief. Here we go, there's some people here. You know, they're visiting their relatives. They can help me. But before Zhang ran over there and asked for their help, he watched one of them sort of turn their bodies, and they looked back at Zhang. And instantly, Zhang's body was overcome with terror once again. Because this person was not a person. This was a faceless, dark figure, just like the one he had encountered near the pond. And there was this horrible sense that this thing was looking right at him. And so horrified, Zhang just turned and ran away. That night, Zhang found himself inexplicably back at that small pond. Didn't even know how he got there, but at this point, he wasn't questioning anything, because he didn't understand any of this. And as he was next to this pond, at some point, he had that heaviness come over him, and before long, he was on the ground, closing his eyes. However, this time, as he sort of slept or became unconscious, he entered into this sort of dream state where he became aware that there were whispers all around him. Somebody or something was trying to communicate with him, and at first he couldn't tell what it was. But then he realized it was like the earth was talking to him. It was like the rocks and the nearby water were literally speaking to him. And for some reason, this felt sort of comforting, even though again, he has no idea what to make of this. And then when Zhang woke up again, it was bright out, and all of a sudden Zhang was aware that the forest was alive again. There were sounds coming from everywhere, animals, insects, there was water sounds. It was like things were back to normal. And Zhang, he also had this incredible clear-headedness that he hadn't had for the past several days. It really was like things had gone back to normal. And so Zhang stood up and he heard the sound of running water nearby, and he followed it to a stream. And so he decided he would just follow this stream right on out of the MacLehose Trail. Like this was going to be the way he would get out of here. But after walking for hours and hours along the stream, he still had not found his way out. The sun was now directly overhead, beaming down on him. He was so hot, he was tired, he was moving slower and slower. His optimism was beginning to fade. And then he looked up, and just up ahead, he saw something that destroyed any of the optimism he had left. Because right up ahead were 3 more shadow figures with their back to him. It was like they were blocking his way towards freedom. And so as Zhang tensed up and prepared to turn and run back deeper into this trail that he was trying to escape, one of these shadow figures turned, and they looked directly at Zhang. And when they did, everything changed. Because Zhang instantly realized this was no shadow figure. This was a real person. They had a face, and they were calling out to him saying, "Hey, do you need any help?" And Zhang was so relieved, so happy. He couldn't even say anything back. He just fell to his knees and wept tears of joy. He was finally saved. It would turn out Zhang's wife had called the police on that first night when Zhang didn't come home. And so the whole time Zhang was out in the woods over these several days, there was actually a massive search party out there looking for him. However, none of the searchers claimed to have seen or heard Zhang at any point, and Zhang did not see or hear any of the searchers. Those people at the end who finally rescued him were just random hikers that happened to see him. But somehow, despite the fact that Zhang really could not have gone very far from his car, I mean, he really didn't cover a huge distance on this trail when this whole experience began, despite that, the searchers never heard or saw Zhang at any point, and Zhang obviously never heard or saw any of them. So they're basically in the exact same area, looking for each other, but nobody sees each other. After being discovered by those 3 real people on MacLehose Trail, Zhang was taken to a hospital where he was examined, and it was determined there was nothing physically wrong with him, other than he had not had much to eat or drink in several days. In fact, the official explanation for what happened to Zhang was just that he was really dehydrated. However, Zhang didn't buy that explanation. And when Zhang left the hospital and got back home, he immediately began digging into the history of the MacLehose Trail, and he would quickly discover that he was not the first person to have a totally wild, bizarre, borderline paranormal experience out on that trail. It would turn out the MacLehose Trail cuts across a geographic line called the Sai Kung Barrier. This is an area of the Sai Kung Peninsula that is generally considered to be a portal to other dimensions. And there have been enough people to have otherworldly experiences out on this trail that loosely match what Zhang claims to have seen and experienced, that they dubbed the area this trail is in as the Bermuda Triangle of South China. And adding even more intrigue to this area is the fact that several other very experienced hikers have gone missing along this trail, and they've had huge search parties sent out for them, but they were never found. Zhang would eventually share his story of what happened to him out on the trail in a 3,500-word essay that he posted on social media. He, and many others, believe that when he first fell and collapsed on the trail, that he actually fell through the Sai Kung Barrier and entered another dimension. That for those days that he was wandering around having no idea what was happening to him, that he wasn't really in this dimension anymore. He was somewhere else. Zhang believed the only reason he was able to escape this other dimension was because on his final night in this other place, he began to hear the sounds of the rocks and the water whispering to him. He said the only reason he was able to hear that was because he had sort of accepted his fate, that here he was in this totally strange world that he couldn't understand and didn't have any real expectation to escape from. And it was that sort of resignation that he allowed himself to feel that kind of put him in touch with this dimension, and he believes that's what ultimately allowed him to come back home. Despite those who doubt him, Zhang stands by his version of events. While his time on the trail did not cause him any physical harm, to this day he is still haunted by it.